Hi, my name is Jim Lahey, and I am a bread expert. Look what we got here. So these are two white breads. They look like they're made with 100% white flour, but if it's cooked properly, you'll see this kind of crackling on the outside of the bread that's a result of the bread shrinking after it cools down. This bread here, which definitely looks like an industrially manufactured bread, and instead of having cracks like this one does, it has these wrinkles in it, which is the result of all the additives that were put into the bread to allow it to expand. This bread looks more like modern bread, the future. Psh, rocket ships. This bread looks more like the past. But I prefer this bread because it's my personal bias. However, I understand the utility and the thought behind this. This is the bread that has saved hundreds of millions of people from starvation because it can be manufactured industrially. I'm going to cut this one in half in the middle. So when we look at a loaf of bread, we can break it down into its parts. There's the size, the shape, the color, the form. When we look at the interior of the loaf of bread, we see what's called the crumb structure. So all those little holes are bubbles called alveoli. So the reason why flour is so white is because of the milling process that takes place. The grain itself has less carotenoids, less color pigments in it, and then during a high-speed milling process, carotenoids that are in it become blanched or bleached, and in a lot of cases, with a lot of commercial wheat brands that we all know and love, bromides and bleaching agents are used to make it even whiter. And I'm going to taste it just because I kind of feel like if I don't. It has a very yeasty smell, so let's taste it. It's definitely tough, and it's pleasant. The salt's at about 2.5%. Loaf B. This looks like a foot-long hot dog bun to me. Cut it in half, so you can see that this is a very spongy crumb, and you can see the difference right here side by side. The crust on this is thicker, the crust on this is thinner. The hydration on this dough is probably a lot less. This is probably like 65, 68% hydration, maybe even lower. You can see when I tried cutting this bread with a very sharp bread knife, it just crumbled and fell apart. This bread, by contrast, kind of held together. But this is obviously, there's no fight, but it has, for me, some kind of oil, something very unpleasant about it. Based on the weight alone, and also the manufacturing qualities, flavor, all that, I would say that this is worth at least double what this is. Aha! Well, look at that. I may have dished on this loaf of bread, but to its credit, it's probably saved hundreds of millions of people from starvation because the mass manufacture of bread has enabled countries, societies to feed its population, especially during times of great economic hardship. Let's see what we have here. Let me see. Bigger, light, smaller, light, crunchy, mushy. I wonder what these are. Well, this looks like it was baked in a pan. I do smell natural fermentation. Cinnamon? Vanilla? Some unusual flavor profiles. This looks like this was baked on a stone hearth. Look at this. Does look like someone threw some flour on top to make it look quote unquote rustic, although doesn't look like that flour here was incidental to the way that the bread was made. It looks like it was done for effect. I don't know what effect it has. But there it is. This one's like very, 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 very dark. So this bread must have some bitter flavors. This has one score down the middle, a little bit of burnt flour on here. So I'm assuming there might be something in this dough to cause such extreme coloration. But it looks really interesting. I like it. The salt in the dough crystallizes on the inside of the alveoli, creating this lighter color. So what you're seeing really is salt. I call it salt scoring, but look at that lovely even crumb. I'm going to cut open this loaf and see what we get. Whoa, that's color, huh? This is a really open crumb structure. This is a very tight crumb structure. If I had to choose based on appearances, this looks like probably a whole wheat bread. When you take 100% of the grain and you mill it, you end up with whole wheat flour. That's the endosperm, it's the bran, the germ. White flour goes through a series of sieves, a series of screens, and has all the outside of the wheat berry. So about roughly 30% of the wheat is removed to make white flour. Let's taste our loaf of bread. It has a very chewy, almost rubbery texture to it. Definitely see a lot of flecks of bran in here. I would say this dough was put in a refrigerator and allowed to proof or slow proof for maybe 6 to 10 hours based on the amount of blistering, maybe more. It's got a very firm crust. Has a somewhat even, like a cakey crumb because it's kind of loose. Extremely tart, but it has a lot going on. Nutty, sweet, sour. The texture is utterly bizarre. If I had to guess, I without a question, I would say this is the more expensive loaf of bread just because of all the things in it that tell me how it was made. Its finished qualities are certainly higher and more difficult. Oh, there we go. Yeah, look at that. If I'm going to spend $11 for a loaf of bread, I'll buy this one for $11. When you're shopping for a whole wheat bread, the number one ingredient should say whole wheat flour. So something can be sold as whole wheat but have very little whole wheat in it. I'd question whether or not this is actually whole wheat bread, although it could be a strain of white whole wheat, albino whole wheat, which has become very popular for people who find the color of brown breads unappealing, but they're both very good loaves of bread. I can guess that we have rye bread here. This looks like the standard American rye bread, which really isn't truly rye bread. It's mostly white flour. And this here looks like real whole grain rye sourdough. And this is definitely that. This is a very dense bread. This is obviously a lighter, more sandwich-friendly bread. If you were in Germany or Northern Europe, Scandinavia, this is the bread of northern climes. This bread is kind of more like normal bread that you would eat in a cafeteria or a diner or a typical restaurant in America. Well, there's definitely some sugar or some syrup of some sort in here, maybe malt. In terms of the crumb structure, and this is obviously very fine and very dense. This is like a brick. Rye has less gluten, so typically when you see this traditional rye bread, you'll see it baked in a pan, so it's always going to have this square form. You'll even see these little marks on the top, which are equivalent of scoring the bread. The dough is oftentimes pierced to keep the consistency of the crumb even. The acidity of this dough allows it to have an incredibly long shelf life, so there's something practical about the use of rye. I'm going to guess that this one's more expensive. Whoa. This bread has a lot of whole grain in it. There's probably a lot more going on in terms of the fermentation and the processing of this. This loaf is a little bit more sandwich ready. I would even say it was probably formed by a machine. Just by looking at the spiral in here, it's so even and so consistent. This would be a real 100% rye bread. This would be marketed as a rye bread. So if you're looking for a rye bread, depending on your preference, again, look at the packaging. The number one ingredient should say rye flour. Number one. And that's definitely the case with this bread here. Well, they're very dense, compact. They're both very similar in that respect. The crumb structure and the alveoli, more or less the same in terms of the density. This does feel more moist, like maybe there's some additives to this bread. This bread is a lot drier than here. Let's give it a taste. It's tart. Definitely a sourdough of some sort. This doesn't smell sour at all. There's a little acidity to it, but it smells like a yeast leavened bread, but tastes like a sourdough. That's interesting. A true sourdough, or naturally leavened bread, is a combination of yeast and bacteria that leaven and break down bread. And in the process of leavening the bread, as the dough begins to age, it changes its pH. And it will drop as low as 4.4 pH to produce that sour flavored bread. The bread to my left, I'm going to assume it's a bread from a supermarket, but when I taste it, it tastes distinctively sour. So I'm going to assume that this is a bread leavened with yeast with a culture, meaning a mix of rye flour or enzymes to make it taste sour. And I'm going to assume that this is some small bakery using natural leavening. I would say most likely this one's more expensive, but we'll see. Oh, there you go. When you're tasting a loaf of sourdough bread, compare it to a tomato. An average tomato would have a pH of about 4.5, 4.4. So you're looking for that same level of acidity. Trust your tongue. Looks like we have some type of flatbreads, focaccia of some sort. Looks like one of those commercially available, pre-made, do-your-own pizza at home disc type things that you find in supermarkets. It has these weird kind of grates underneath it, so maybe it was put on a wire rack to cool after it was partially baked. It feels kind of dense. It's very floppy. It smells like grain. It has a lot of color on the bottom. That means that it was actually cooked on a hot surface or a hearth. So these are focaccia for sure. This bread looks like it has some cheese or something on top of it. This looks like it was probably dimpled by human hands. It's extremely irregular. Let's cut these open and see what we get when we look inside. I'm assuming, because this is an industrial bread, that it has all sorts of functional food additives. It looks like this bread wasn't that fermented. And this bread, on the other hand, certainly looks a lot more fermented. You can see the crumb is more open. It's a very, very thin crust. You can see the difference if you want to do a comparison. Flatbreads are usually baked under dry conditions because they don't need moisture to expand. About 50% of the surface area of a flatbread is on a hearth or a sole of an oven. And as a result, the moisture inside, the humidity and moisture inside the bread can transpire through that surface that the dough has contact on. So obviously with flatbreads, you don't want to see them too crispy or crunchy, unless of course it's a cracker, which technically is a flatbread. I've never done this, so I'm going to taste for the very first time a industrially produced That is pretty foul. But I can see how some people might enjoy it. Let's try this one here. I can taste the olive oil. It's very, very good. So this is definitely a focaccia scacciata pizza bianca. I'm gonna guess that this bread costs more, but I could be wrong. Oh yeah, but not by much. This bread makes more money though, because this is made industrially. So, when you're out shopping for your focaccia at your local retail baker, what you want in a focaccia is that it's open, the crumb is open and airy and not dense. The crust should be very thin. You should definitely taste the salt and the olive oil. When you're out there shopping for bread, ask your local baker or retailer for a taste of the bread. Ask how that bread was made. Bread, after all, has been with us for over 14,000 years, and it's something that should be available to all of us. So go out there and ask for a taste.